Hello, everyone. Welcome to Data Borders, How Silicon Valley is Building an Industry Around Immigrants, book talk and Q&A with Dr. Melissa Villanicolas of UCLA and moderated by Dr. Kevin Escudero here at Brown. I would like to start by sharing our land acknowledgement. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are with ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonialization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe have been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. Welcome again. My name is Dr. Vincent Harris, and I'm the Associate Dean and Director of the Brown Center for Students of Color at Brown University, also known as the BCSC. A little about the BCSC. In May of 1968, the Afro-American Society at Brown student group walked out and soon after formed and asked for what was named the Third World Center. This action was done not only by Black students, but also collectively by Asian American, Latinx, and various students from various different identities, mostly possessed of women at the time. The creation to form TWC was in 1976, and later we were renamed the Brown Center for Students of Color in 2014. The BCSC serves as a gathering place for communities of color, students who are encouraged to build meaningful relationships across differences, develop racial and ethnic conscious, enact change at Brown and beyond. And the BCSC continues to advance the university's mission of educating and preparing students to discharge the offices of life with usefulness and reputation by empowering students of color, all students, to cultivate leadership, facilitating critical reflection, and fostering informed actions and promoting social justice. Today's conversation, hosted by the BCSC Speaker Series in collaboration with the Brown University Libraries, Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender, the Undocumented First Generation College Low Income Student Center, UFLI, is Data Borders, How Silicon Valley is Building an Industry Around Immigrants. This virtual lecture with Dr. Melissa Villanicolas, Assistant Professor at UCLA, will be moderated again by Dr. Kevin Escarado, Assistant Professor here at Brown. At this time, I'm going to share with you both of their bios and then turn it over to Professor Mel to kick us off. First, I'm going to start with Professor Kevin. He is an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies and an affiliated faculty member in the Sociology Department and Population Studies and Training Center at Brown University. His research centers on comparative ethnic studies, Native Pacific studies, and U.S. imperialism, militarism, immigration, and social movements in law. Escudaro's book, Organizing While Undocumented, 2020, New York Press, examined Latinx and Asian undocumented immigrant youth, cultivation, and use of an intersectional movement identity to facilitate coalition building with members of other underrepresented groups. His current book manuscript, Imperial Unsettling, under advanced contract with the University of Hawaii Press, focuses on indigenous Kamarhu and Philip Nix immigrants, participants in Gahaning ongoing decolonization movement. Professor Kevin, you can correct those names a little later for me. Escarado is a recipient of a Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Fellowship, Eastern Sociological Society Public Sociology Award for Early Career Scholars, Association for Asian American Studies Early Career Achievement Award, and a National Science Foundation Career Award. Now I'll read the bio for Dr. Melissa Villanicolas. She is an assistant professor at UCLA Department of Information Studies. Her first book, Latinas on the Line, Invisible Information Workers in Telecommunications Workers Press, received an honorable mention for the Labor Tech Network Book Award for 2022. Her second book, Data Borders, How Silicon Valley is Building an Industry Around Immigrants, which we're discussing today, was released with UC Press and received the McGannon Center Book Award from Fordham University. Dr. Melissa has received numerous awards, including the Diversity and Inclusive Excellence Award at the University of Rhode Island, the Library Juice Press Paper Contest for her work on information and incarceration, and the Gender and Women's Studies Smalley Fellowship for the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is an affiliate of the Chicana Studies Research Center and DataX's Data Justice and Critical Data Studies. Dr. Melissa has her PhD in Information Sciences from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Melissa for our book talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Harris, for that introduction. It's great to be with you all. And thank you to Brown and all of the co-sponsors for putting on this event. I'll go ahead and share my slides. So thank you again for having me. So I can't see you all, and I'm going to go ahead and make my own screen invisible so I can focus on the slides, but turn those captions off so I don't throw off the real captions. Hopefully that's okay. So can you take a moment and reflect on if you use any of these resources? Raise your hand or mentally raise your hand and check off the list if you use any of the following. Amazon, scholarly research databases like LexisNexis or Elsevier, walking in public, using the post office, going to the DMV. These are all the ways that we enter into this emerging state of that I call data borders, where we find that our data is intimately linked to the U.S. Homeland Security's ICE and Border Patrol, which journalists, scholars, and political and community organizers have revealed through various methods. So we're increasingly seeing immigrant data and sort of launched off of Latinx immigrants at the US-Mexico border in particular, and particularly biodata engaged at this as the surface for which information technology is mobilized. Recent investments in data collection in the US-Mexico border and throughout the country have become a highly profitable industry. Companies such as Anduril, Palantir, Amazon, Clearview AI, BI2, and DNA testing companies all have a stake in gathering data of undocumented people in ports of entry, borderlands, detention centers, and immigrant populated cities, and subsequently gathering US citizens' data as well. While surveillance and contentious relations along the US-Mexico border are not new, what is new is the scale in which this data is gathered and the growing merger between Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense. Truthout estimated that by 2023, borderland technology would be a $740 billion industry. So I named this current phenomenon as data body milieu. Data body milieu is this emerging state of borderland surveillance that brings all residents into an intimate place where our data lives together, defines us in digital borderlands, and places immigrant data at the center of technological innovation and development. And I focus in particular on Latinx immigrants on the US-Mexico border, but certainly those aren't the only immigrants passing through the US-Mexico border or that are sort of this technology is used on. Borderland milieu is a term that historian Oscar Martinez coined in his study of how people live in the US-Mexico border. They form relationships, cultures merge, sometimes cultures appropriated, and there's a friction, there's relationships, people adopt each other's values. So there's a sort of precedent of borderland studies that we have. Dr. Harris talked about launching their center from the 60s, these movement in the 60s and 70s. So we have borderland studies, of course, that comes from these field movements in the 60s and 70s that really work to define borderlands. Borders are geographic locations, but they're also imagined and made tangible through geopolitics. And borders change, of course, the definition of citizenship and borderlands change over time. Mexico and the US became a more tangible line when it was more monitored around Chinese immigrant entry by way of Mexico. So borders are constructed over time. Borderland theory argues that borders are not always geographic location, but also include consciousness and identity formation. So immigrant communities that pass through borders really bring their experiences with them, and borderlands reside within that experience as well. Borderlands are geographic, they're subjective, and they're part of identity consciousness. And in this way, the data body can be physical and ubiquitous. The data body was sort of first established by author Felix Stalder as a shadow body that follows us through classification and measurement. It is digitized into bytes, especially as consumers when we use our credit cards, of course, or purchase things online. This data body comes with rewards and necessities for life chances, but also shadows sort of the necropolitics of death that when the data body doesn't necessarily permit something such as necessary health insurance or housing. So the data body has really high stakes that are based, of course, on race, gender, and sexuality. It echoes and often exasperates inequity and stratification of the physical body. The Our Data Bodies project states our data body can follow behind us like a digital shadow, impacting the choices and opportunities we face in the future. Though our data bodies are mostly digital, the collection, analysis, and sharing of data have a profound impact on our ability to meet our basic material needs: food, shelter, medical care, safety, and employment. So the justification of building more surveillance technologies for life chances and expanding these data bodies happens through what Ruha Benjamin calls the new Jim Code, wherein technologies that harm, especially Black communities, are justified through their efficiency and ability to move society forward. We see that narrative a lot in this data body milieu. Um, so ultimately, what I want to sort of put out there about the data body milieu is that citizens, undocumented people, DACA, people of all different privileges with citizenship sort of exist in this data borderlands by way of our data. It's our social media data, library databases, the DMV working together to build a new borderland for surveillance and deportations. It's that sense that your information is somehow linked to a massive surveillance project. Immigrants are valued as data used for purposes of technological design and valuable as a source of data in and of itself. And that emerging state is launching technological innovation. Um, so in this lecture, I really want to just talk about the methods and literature conversations that I'm in. I acknowledge Latinx histories of technology, and then I go into three trends that I see in the data borders. The US-Mexico border as this new Silicon Valley, Latinx immigrants hailed as data and grounds for technological innovations, and intimate entrances into the data borders that we find ourselves in, and then offer some responses that are being sort of circulated. So for methods, I use public-facing informations, tech companies' contracts with ICE, government documents, mainstream media. I sort of do a content analysis of everything that's out there that I can get my hands on. But I also interview Latinx folks from my hometown. So I'm second generation Mexican American from Southern California. I was born in LA, but grew up in Riverside County. And so my hometown in Marietta, California is heavily surveilled area where we have a border checkpoint. We grew up with a border checkpoint. There is a border facility that houses people and it's been cited for inhuman conditions. There's always a border patrol off the side of our freeway, just sitting there. And I know a lot of folks that grew up in borderlands, your border patrol is always in your sort of life. But I really try to contrast my experience. I talk about in the book, like I saw my mom like grilled by Border Patrol growing up because Border Patrol was more like in a qualitative way, they would interview people trying to get through border checkpoints. Um, in that way that I've sort of experienced the physicalness of Border Patrol and that some of you might have that grew up in the borderlands, I do think that we need to consider that our data lives in a similar borderlands, but that we don't have the effective experience of seeing that movement, right? But it's still there. One example of this emerging data borders is on the screen here this job, like it was actually a job for an ICE senior analysis for my hometown. And what reads interesting about this job posting is that it's really almost, for myself being in information science, it's almost like an information studies job. Like it's almost pointed at folks that might have studied how to retrieve information. You need to have media literacy in Thomson Reuters database, in LexisNexis databases. You really need to have more data training than we think of like the physical border patrol out there or the physicalness of ICE. So that's one example of how these sort of data borders move in our own personal experiences. And then I interview undocumented people from my hometown, really through qualitative research in what we call counter data storytelling. Counter data storytelling is established through Diagnosio and Klein, through data feminism. It's really just trying to counter these big data methods, right? Where sort of the more data you have, the more like inferences you can make. But counter data storytelling, it values other types of data, which is really like, I think, kind of reaches back to the establishment of ethnic studies, valuing qualitative research and interviews and oral histories that underrepresented communities might not usually be valued for, right? I am often in conversation with folks in my field, but also in like new media studies, of course, Latinx studies, science and technology studies, and gender and race. Of course, Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression really establishes for us that that technology is not neutral, that these sort of algorithms are built around the same structures of race and racism that have always been there that organize like housing and education and health. Um, these other books, Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction and Automated Equality by Virginia Eubanks, demonstrate how algorithms are used for sort of giving folks life chances like access to healthcare and access to education and rights. Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology really establishes this idea of the new Jim Code. That these sort of incarcerating technologies are proliferated and moved forward by way of like a benign justification that we see a lot in data borders. And Sarah Landon's Data Cartels comes out of library studies. Sarah Landon's a former librarian. Right now, she's the head of the Office of Intellectual Freedom for ALA. I really recommend that book to understand sort of the value of data, and this place that we find ourselves in with databases that we use in libraries every day. So these are some of my leading questions that I use to write this book. I'm really interested in how are most people in the US now connected to ICE surveillance systems. I kind of try to encourage like in the most sci-fi way you can, thinking of you have this shadow self like out there living its data life. And we don't always get to know what that is, right? Because those companies that have contracts with ICE and Department of Homeland Security, they don't have to like show us the back end of their own databases or technologies. So I'm interested in how we are connected to those ICE systems, how are technologies designed around Latinx immigrant data? How are most people experiencing a borderlands through their data, whether we're conscious of it or not? And what does it mean that many people's data is constantly correlated to ICE surveillance system, but we can't feel those borderlands? So the project kind of for me became, how do we name borderlands that we can't see into or always feel or know how it's moving? And that's really what I hope to do through interviewing and documented folks from my area who I know were in detention centers, who have like sort of intimate relationships with that high level of surveillance. This is just a brief interlude. Let me do a little tea drink that I like to give to kind of like erupt that idea of that binary of like Latinx immigrants as like oppressed, or like Latinx immigrants as not having technology, but understanding that Latinx Latinx is in the US, and of course like in Mexico and Latin America have histories of technologies. I won't go into all of these, but this is sort of my bigger life project, is writing the Latinx histories of technologies. So I like to go back to the traqueros in the late 19th century, Mexican men that were migrants that were brought into the US to work on the railroad tracks as kind of the early formations of telecommunications. I found in my book, I talk about how even in the Providence Journal, they discuss like the truckeros as being out as far as Rhode Island building the railroads. But what you find in this discourse is like Mexican men being placed as sort of superhuman, and like they're the only ones that can do this superhuman work in all climates, right? So they're physically compatible with this type of technological labor. And that's what we find with a lot of technological labor. Mexican women on the border are some of the primary builders, constructors of electronics in factories, and US, Chinese, and Mexican factories. And so are Chinese women in China, right? So these are sort of the women that are hired to hand make electronics. And it's sort of justified when these spaces are hiring all women, that like these women are biologically suited to assemble these electronics, that they have fine, delicate hands that can handle this type of labor. We see throughout Latinx technology histories sort of a justification of where Latinxes can be aligned with technologies based on like a biological um, suitability, like not necessarily with coding or doing the work of like supercomputers, that's the higher paid work, but always inferred as like biologically suited for the hard labor of technology. So I talk about that in my book, Latinas on the Line, and in other works that I've worked on, and I'll probably just keep working on that narrative like forever until I retire. But Latinas on the Line, I also wrote about my family because my mom and my aunts were hired as telephone operators in the 1970s. And so I write about that as well. So, sort of moving on from that interlude, just to promote that there is a Latinx tech history, but it is sort of always intimately entwined with racial organization, right? Which we could also say about other groups as well. Um, I really want to think about this integration of the physical borderlands and the data borderlands. So there's this emerging data borderland that reorganizes Silicon Valley around the US-Mexico border. Back in 2006 was the first discussion around this idea of a virtual smart border wall. The Department of Homeland Security gave a contract to Boeing, and it was kind of considered a failed initiative. It was called the SBI Net. Um, over years, the project was considered failed, and the sort of narrative was that Boeing couldn't handle the rough terrain of the US-Mexico border. So in 2010s, we really see this shift from our traditional defense companies of like Boeing and Elbit, to have Silicon Valley companies bid to build this idea of a smart virtual wall. And the idea here is that Silicon Valleys are sort of more innovative and could take on this big project of the border wall. So the Department of Homeland Security moved to a annex office into Silicon Valley around 2010. And then we also see that Silicon Valley starts moving annex offices along the US-Mexico border. And what's really common is this sort of idea of innovation. So, Homeland Security announced that they would establish a satellite office to engage entrepreneurs and innovators from small startups and large companies. The SVO's mission is to tap into the innovation of the private sector in new ways, opening the doors for non-traditional performers to work with the government and pose the government as a viable customer for their technology. Silicon Valley companies like Quanergy Electric also started moving down to the border to have their own annex and be close to that geographic space. And what we see is that they also kind of see the borderland as the new lab. It's this new, like, it's the new Silicon Valley, like, equivalent of their Google campus, right? Because they have all this space to work on drones and different technologies to sort of capture the landscape of the border. Um, these companies all have a stake in gathering data of undocumented people in ports of entry, borderlands, and detention centers, and immigrant populated cities. And what we find is that they really kind of take up this mantle or this challenge to essentially capture folks along the border. And this idea of a smart wall or virtual border wall is really like a two-party idea. So both Democrats and Republicans support it. They consider it a safer approach, is building technology along the border instead of the sort of eyesore of a physical wall. You have different innovations that will work the same as a border wall. So I want to show a little example of what we're talking about here when we think about like the hardware of the virtual border wall. So this is a clip around how some of the tech is proposed to build along the border.
Tech companies are trying to make it easier for Border Patrol agents to do their jobs and also come up with an effective border solution that would be cheaper for taxpayers than building a physical wall. The Government Accountability Office estimates that could cost $18 billion.
That's a lot of sense, though.
One company called Quanergy has been flying here from Silicon Valley for a year to test its surveillance system. Quanergy took LiDAR technology it developed for self-driving cars and built out a high-tech virtual border wall. It can detect movement within 360 degrees and 200 meters of the sensor. The software can tell the difference between people and animals. It would then send alerts to Border Patrol when people are detected.
What LiDAR has the ability to do is to give you speed buffer warning, to say at 100 meters that something is approaching, be aware. And then by the time they 5 meters away, as an example, well, okay, this is a serious issue. Hopefully by then the security forces have been mobilized and are ready to respond to what might be at the perimeter. That's what's really unique about LiDAR. It is immune to a lot of the adverse weather conditions. Dark time's the best time for the sensor because it's not working like a camera system where it needs ambient lighting to be able to get a good picture or good image.
Donald Trump won.
Okay, so that's just one example of just one company sort of proposing and giving a bid to, at the time, that was the first Trump administration, to design a sort of 3D border wall. Try to transfer here. Okay. So when I spoke to people from my hometown who had crossed the border without documentation, they associated emerging borderland technologies as more danger the more surveillance technologies along the border, the more people that people crossing would have to take dangerous steps to evade that. 39-year-old Juana, who had come from when she was younger to Lake Elsinore, California, discussed often how these emerging technologies were making the border more dangerous. She said, right now, I think they're using a lot of technology for everything. I remember when they first started using, when they could see people just walking, when they started with the drones. A man told me you have to cover your footprints because of the technology of tracing the footprints. The cameras, it seems impossible to come here. I mean, it's not, but we have to make it safer for people crossing in general. So it's not about them being watched. So in my interviews, developing information technology and data tracking was correlated with more danger. And there's really a large awareness in immigrant communities of these technologies being developed, especially because I think folks are deciding how to come here. They're quite aware of how the technologies are being used. Immigrants as data subjects constitute this information commodity, this resource for refining algorithmic systems along the border and around the US, and the test cases for emerging technologies, often, of course, without their consent. As undocumented individuals, they frequently exist beyond ethical frameworks that protect citizens. This fervor for technological advancement reflects a resurgence of this idea of an American ethos for competitiveness and innovation, with immigrant data serving as this foundational product to develop new systems around. The architecture of these technologies is constructed through the lens of undocumented individuals as both the target of surveillance and the coveted data point, positioning immigrants at the core of information technology development, similar to what you saw in that video. This impetus for datafication of immigrants, particularly at and around borders, is perpetuated by narratives that erase Latinx contributions to historical development of technology, but also biological deterministic notions that Latinxes are inherently suited for sort of a landscape to develop technology around. So what we find is that folks are heavily datafied, and this is just one example of a sort of prop or proposal for a data wall. Coolfire Core is one of many companies proposing AI models for a digital border wall. According to Coolfire, they say we help people operating on the front line, struggling to make decisions, challenged with doing what is right. We empower everyday people to be everyday heroes. Coolfire describes this digital wall as a row of ground sensors, and essentially what this digital wall does is it determines a person from an animal or an object. It flags a border patrol, and then border patrol will go be called out to where people are. In this model, people in borderlands are cast as unpredictable objects with no data and visualized, usually in this like stick figure form. Coolfire Core proposes this situational awareness platform to make undocumented subjects this capturable information object. So what emerges from this commercial military hybrid is what I call military industrial startup complex. This new sort of industry praise that merges tech companies that hold contracts with Department of Homeland Security and ICE. The merging of these commercial and defense industries is highly profitable and is sort of built up through bidding for contracts, essentially. In 2019, Palmer Luckey of Anduril Industries described the goal of merging civilian and military engagement with artificial intelligence and technologies. And this became really the central struggle that I talked about earlier in an earlier lecture for Silicon Valley companies. And it's this tension of merging military and commercial products beyond what we were accustomed to with Boeing, right? Which Boeing is a defense company. We also fly on Boeing airplanes, but the really vision here in these sort of early aughts discussions or earlier aughts discussions was like that this Silicon Valley culture will be brought into military defense. And Lucky is sort of trying to pitch Palmer Luckey, who's the founder of Anduril. He was the founder of Oculus. Oculus, he basically created a new virtual reality goggle that really changed virtual reality goggles. But here he's really trying to make a pitch to sort of these Silicon Valley commercial companies that the new way to do things is to merge with defense to be competitive with China. And he says, in China, there's no difference between their civil sector and military sector. It's all one thing. That's why when you help Chinese companies work on artificial intelligence, you're almost directly helping the Chinese military work on artificial intelligence. A lot of people in Silicon Valley don't really understand this. Now, he's trying to appeal to companies to not work with China, but essentially he's laying out the makeup of these new Silicon Valley companies. And what we find in this these new models is what I call the machine learning feedback loop. That is that this data that's gathered along the US-Mexico border or data gathered around surveillance of immigrants is fed back into those commercial products to improve those systems. And those commercial products, that data is fed back into military defense to improve those systems. Critical computing scholar Sava Singh gives the example of Gmail accounts that refine autocorrect and predictive writing within an email. So when you're writing your email in Gmail and it asks you like, do you want to write this instead? And you're like, oh, okay. That automated service changes us, but we also go on to change it because it's sort of gathering our data and improving the system. So immigrant data feeds into multiple tracking systems such as Amazon Cloud Services, LexisNexis. What we saw in the video earlier was this idea of a 3D wall. And that 3D wall is built through a type of technology that's used for the self-driving car. There's not a division for that company between their tech for the self-driving car and their tech for the border. So that data that's collected on the border will go to improve the data that improves the self-driving car tech, and the data from the self-driving car will go on to improve the border. That's sort of the intimate system that we find ourselves in. And I put an example here also of sort of the embeddedness of defense technology, although this is a rather extreme example, is a recent use of a war robot at a club in San Francisco. And people paid to sort of go to a party that was DJ'd by essentially a robot used in war. But really that this idea that that's how sort of embedded our intimate lives are with defense tech. My interview collaborators were highly aware that they were being watched essentially and datafied through their technology. They use technology for their everyday lives, of course, like their smartphones, computers, and video games. And during the presidential administrations of Trump and Biden, young people I interviewed who had DACA, who were hoping to continue their DACA status, would use their phones often to keep their DACA status and also to try to apply. None of the people I interviewed felt that their information was private. It was really mitigated use, a critical decision on how to use technology for their own life. It's kind of scary. 24-year-old Teresa, who has DACA status, told me, she said, I know if I search sushi places near me, sushi stuff comes up. Will pop up on other apps. It makes you wonder what else. I feel like if they really wanted to, they know where I am. My interview collaborator, Juana, described a phenomenon that many people experience around surveillance technologies. She told me that when she was visiting her sister-in-law she couldn't help but wonder about heat and body sensors reading her anxieties as they drove through border checkpoints. Because there's sort of this imagined awareness and a reality from other friends that have been in detention centers about what kind of technologies they're seeing. And there's a shared knowledge of what kind of heavy surveillance technologies they're seeing in the border. So it's sort of this an unknown awareness of like when surveillance technologies are being used, but really aware of what type are being used in detention centers, especially. Many people exchange stories about the type of technologies they've observed. So Latinx immigrants weigh the costs and benefits of exchanging their data for entrances into the privileges of citizenship, but hyper conscious of residing in this data border state. Residents of the US navigate these data borders through public and private spheres, such as libraries, post offices, the DMV facilities, and even within the intimate confines of their homes via smart technologies. This data body milieu, this complex web of information, exists in this nebulous space where questions of data ownership and interconnectedness of citizen consumer data remain unsolved. That uncertainty binds US citizens and undocumented individuals alike, as both groups are enmeshed in a system where locations, control, and value of their data are ambiguous. So sort of, I kind of make the argument that we need our data to kind of come out from hiding so that we can be aware of how intimate we are with this data border state. So there's one example that you can do this with, but it's done with sort of a bit of privilege. You need an ID, a driver's license, or and you need your full legal name. And so you can click on this LexisNexis link, which I probably, you can try to type it in and find it. But essentially, you can request how LexisNexis gathers your data to be able to see how much there is. I did that and I got like 70 pages of my own data portfolio. These are gathered so that they can be bought and sold to different companies. And you can also click on this and opt out. So that's also a nice option, but it is helpful to be able to sort of extract and see how much data is being sort of collected and traded or sold off as a way to try to make that data borders more visible. So I call that state citizen milieu really where all people are sort of and intimately connected to data collections. Data surveillance privacy violations are often not experienced linearly. For example, surveillance and policing might be happening for years before the public is aware of such violations. I call this phenomenon retroactive privacy violation consciousness. I know it's a mouthful. I couldn't think of anything like snappier, but in that consumers and surveillance targets may not know how much information technologies are used until years after that happened. One example is Palantir, one of the biggest holders of contracts with ICE, demonstrates this non-linear intimacy of defense, detention, and deportation. In 2018, it was revealed that Palantir had been using predictive policing and crime forecasting in New Orleans and Chicago on Black communities, and that was since 2012. That system used networks between people, places, cars, and weapons, social media posts, and other information to determine who is surveilled and sort of stopped by the police. This algorithm looks at not only who has been arrested before, but people that they're predicting would be arrested, essentially. United States citizens in private and public spheres are entangled in a constant state of this borderland surveillance. So federal law allows that all citizens within 100 miles of the border can be surveilled. So that's essentially 2/3 of the US. And this method of data collection, of course, has also made our way into intimate and private public spaces. So Amazon is one example as well. Amazon holds a cloud contract with the Department of Homeland Security, so they essentially house all that data in a cloud. Um, but what the takeaway here for is that we don't really get to see the back workings of these companies, but oftentimes we find out about them like years later, that sort of violation of data privacy. So this murky state of unknowing where data is at any given moment was most prevalent with DACA recipients. DACA recipients described this state of unknowing. 24-year-old DACA recipient Teresa said, "There's a lot of immigrants who don't want their children to apply to DACA. You have to give so much information, and many parents are nervous because you're giving them everything. Where we entered, every house we resided in, every 2 years when I do my renewal, I have to do my thumbprint. I have to give my parents names and sibling. It's everything. God forbid something changes. They know where to find you and your family. When it was new, you didn't know if it was legit or there would be repercussions." So I just wanted to sort of end that idea with this quote from San Francisco jail and prison librarian Dr. Jeannie Austin, who thinks a lot about incarceration and information. They ask us, when do you lose control of yourself as a point of information? And I do want to talk a little bit about responses because I know it can be like sort of, okay, well, what do we do? What do we do? So during my interviews, I also asked people how would they reimagine the border, their hometowns, border patrol, and technology. So I didn't want to just think about technological determinism as like if we fix technology, the whole system of like racism is fixed. I really wanted to think of like this idea that's really employed by a lot of Black feminist thought of that imagination is an important part of social change. So I was working with a lot of folks from my hometown, and one of them is a really like avid letter writer with incarcerated people. And so she had told an incarcerated man about the book, and he sent me this letter, this picture. And at the time I was thinking, oh, she described the book and then he imagined his response. So that really launched this idea of techno imagined futures. Like, if there was nothing holding us back, what would we imagine? And I think what we get is some really like doable responses if we're sort of thinking about them in terms of the material application. So one woman that I interviewed, Luce, said that she would use Rapunzel's paintbrush, a version of Rapunzel she saw, so she could paint a doorway and go through her to her mom's house. She said that because as an undocumented person, she can't go back to Mexico and visit her mom. So she's really thinking about like she would create this technology where she can just walk through spaces without the barriers of not having citizenship. And then someone I interviewed, Oscar, said that he would create an app that sort of gave people a fresh start. It would clean their record, so folks that have been deported wouldn't have this record that was following them around. Um, I thought both of those are really applicable, right? Like one is immigration policy and one is incarceration. So kind of leading with this idea of like, let's just go big and imagine anything we could. There's also new themes in immigrant data rights that are really important. There's the Our Data Bodies Project, Electronic Frontier Foundation, Mehente, and Immigrant Defense Project. And of course, there's policy that we can advocate for. So as I've been doing these talks over the years, someone had reached out to me from the California Academic Research and Library Association, and they wrote a policy for their own conferences where they wouldn't allow vendors that don't essentially respect folks' value, that cause harm. So that was their way of sort of blocking at least some library vendors that are gathering ICE data from tabling at their conferences. I thought that was really a really unique way of doing things. And then, of course, include undocumented people in deciding about data privacy bills. So yeah, I'll go ahead and stop there because I know we want time for questions. But there's also other, I talk about in the book sort of this idea of techno-imagined futures, and of really like trying to believe. I know we're in a dodgy place right now, but really trying to believe in imagining a new sort of way of doing data rights, of course.
And I'm just gonna wrap it up here really quickly. I'm Neve McGuigan. I'm the director of the Center for Library Exploration and Research here at Brown University Library. And I just want to share my deepest thanks to Dr. Villa-Nicolas and Dr. Escudero for such a thoughtful and illuminating conversation, and such a positive message, which was, maybe a little unexpected at the start of the talk. I also just want to thank everyone here for being part of this discussion. Privacy and data are really critical concerns, for libraries and for researchers, and it's just a privilege to engage with the Brown community in exploring these issues together. And we hope that this conversation today sparks further reflection and action and research. And to support that, we just compiled a brief guide with links to Dr. Villa-Nicolas's books and articles in our library catalog, and some additional resources for further exploration if you'd like to read a little bit more. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Vincent Harris.
Just want to thank everyone on the call again and just mention some helpful, actionable next steps. Get involved with the BCSC first and foremost. You can scan these QR codes to join our newsletter, to also get engaged in some of our social media and also our website. It's important to know that you can get involved in activism and social justice here at Brown, primarily by connecting with our Campus Activity Center. And you can email bcsc@brown.edu to find out who that point person can be. Within this space, it helps to determine how to protest and demonstrate in a thoughtful manner here on Brown University's campus, which is encouraged. Thank you for sure to Dr. Mel from UCLA, Dr. Kevin from here at Brown for the very thoughtful conversation. I went to LexisNexis already and requested my report because I want to know these details. I want to for sure thank the BCSC professional team and student leaders. Shout out to Nicole and Anna for all their support. Our Brown University libraries, Nev, you did an amazing job coordinating all this through the university library. Undocumented, First Gen, U Fly Center, Julio and his team. And a special shout out to Felicia and the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender, with the inception of this brilliant program and idea for connecting us with Dr. Mel. Of course, we want to shout out our closed captioner, as well as our Brown multimedia team, Hannah and Rob, thank you. Allegra, and of course, the Division of Campus Life. We're just asked for the hosts and the speakers to stay logged on for just a minute while we wrap up the conversation. But everyone else, thank you for attending and enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.